Hello, and welcome to the LAFLA presentation on tenant protections related to COVID-19 for the West Valley in LA County. What you will learn today. Today, we will go over protections afforded to all tenants statewide, LA County protections for unincorporated areas and cities that have not passed their own protections, and also tenant protections by city in the West Valley portion of LA County. Today, we will be reviewing specifically two cities in the West Valley, Burbank and Glendale. Please be aware that this presentation was recorded on April 24th, 2020, and is subject to change. Make sure to double check and confirm the information you hear on the local city websites or contact us at LAFLA if you have any questions. Here we have two West Valley cities in LA County, Burbank and Glendale. The emergency orders in Burbank apply between the dates of March 18th, 2020 to April 30th, 2020. In Burbank, there is no specific notice requirement. That means if you are unable to pay your rent because of reasons related to COVID-19, there is no explicit requirement to provide notice to your landlord. However, we strongly suggest that you provide written notice and let your landlord know if you are unable to pay rent. The repay period in Burbank is 180 days or 6 months, and the emergency order applies to both commercial and residential evictions. In Glendale, the emergency orders apply to commercial properties March 24th, 2020 until April 30th, 2020. In Glendale, the emergency orders apply to residential properties March 24th, 2020 until May 31st, 2020. There are notice requirements in Glendale. If you are unable to pay your rent in Glendale and have a commercial property, you must provide written notice 14 days before rent is due to your landlord. If you are in Glendale and have a residential property and you are unable to pay rent, you must provide written notice before rent is due or a reasonable time afterwards, not to exceed 7 days. So if you are in Glendale, you have to provide notice to your landlord that you're unable to pay your rent, and it needs to be within 7 days after your rent is due. There is some documentation that must be provided, and that documentation is due when the payment of the back rent is due. The payment of the back rent is due in Glendale 360 days, in 360 days or 12 months, and the emergency orders applied to commercial and residential evictions. In Glendale, the city has also issued a rent increase freeze, so that's something to keep note of. Statewide protections, California Judicial Council. Our presentation will begin at the state level. Tenants throughout all of California are afforded the following protections. California Governor's Order. On March 27, 2020, Governor Gavin Newsom signed an executive order that delayed filing an answer by 60 days. However, on April 6, 2020, the California Judicial Council implemented a policy that offers more tenant protections and is applicable statewide. California Judicial Council Orders. On April 6, 2020, the California Judicial Council issued orders informing the public that California courts will not issue a summons in any unlawful detainer case until 90 days after the state emergency has ended. An eviction case cannot proceed throughout the legal process without a summons. So in effect, an eviction case cannot proceed through the legal procedures until 90 days after the state level of emergency. If the eviction case was filed against a tenant before April 6, 2020, then hearing dates will be scheduled after June 22nd, 2020. The order also states that the court will not register any default judgments. If a tenant is served an unlawful detainer and does not answer, the court can enter judgment against the tenant by default. However, the California Judicial Council order prevents that from happening until 90 days after the state emergency is lifted. Los Angeles County protections. In addition to statewide protections, there are ordinances throughout LA County that protect tenants. The Board of Supervisors also passed an ordinance to protect tenants. Local protections for tenants throughout LA County. If a unit is in an unincorporated section of LA County, or the unit is in a city that has not passed its own ordinance, the tenant is afforded the following protections adopted by the LA County Board of Supervisors. Remember, you can find out which law applies to the unit in question by going to www.lavote.net. Summary. The LA County Board of Supervisors enacted this ordinance from March 4th, 2020 until the end of the local emergency. Residential and commercial tenants who cannot pay the rent because of financial impacts related to COVID-19 or who receive no fault notice, a notice for unauthorized occupants or pets, or a notice for nuisance related to COVID-19 are protected from a 3-day notice or eviction if they give the landlord written notice within 7 days of the rent due date. Landlords can collect rent 1 year after the emergency expires. If tenants get an eviction for rent owed during this time, the ordinance can be used as an affirmative defense. Do I still owe the rent? What about late fees? Rent is due in full 1 year after the emergency has expired. Late fees cannot be collected. Financial impacts based on COVID-19. The governor's executive order and each of the ordinances we will review require that a tenant have a financial impact related to COVID-19. What is a financial impact related to COVID-19? For the purposes of the following ordinances, a financial impact related to COVID-19 can be if you have COVID-19, you need to care for a family member who has COVID-19, you have been laid off, lost hours, or have had an income reduction because of COVID-19, you have lost income to comply with safer at home orders, you have lost income to care for a child impacted by school closures, or you have extraordinary medical costs related to COVID-19. We will now review the City of Burbank tenant protections for COVID-19. If I live in Burbank, do I still owe the rent? If I live in Burbank, what about late fees? If you are in Burbank, you do still owe the rent. The rent is due 180 days after the expiration of the emergency period. The rent is due in full. During those 180 days, you cannot be evicted for past rent covered in this ordinance. What about late fees? If you are in Burbank, the landlord can collect late fees for the rent owed. Glendale tenant protections for COVID-19. In Glendale, the emergency orders are effective March 24th, 2020 until May 31st, 2020. All tenants who cannot pay the rent because of financial impacts related to COVID-19 or who received an eviction notice are protected from an eviction if they gave their landlord written notice before the rent is due or within a reasonable period of time afterwards, not to exceed 7 days. Tenants need to provide verifiable documentation upon payment of back due rent. If you get an eviction for rent owed during this time, this ordinance can be raised as an affirmative defense. There is also a rent increase freeze in Glendale for residential tenancies only, and no rent freezes for apartments built after February 1st, 1995, individual condos, and single family dwellings. Commercial tenants need to provide a written notice 14 days before the rent is due, and documentation is due upon payment of back due rent. All tenants get 12 months or 1 year to pay back rent due. Back due rent. If I'm in Glendale, do I still owe the rent? Yes. 1 year, the rent will be due in full 1 year after the expiration of the emergency period. Rent will be due in full. During the year, you cannot be evicted for past rent covered in this ordinance. What about late fees? If you are in Glendale, late fees do not apply. The landlord cannot charge you late fees on the rent amounts covered in this ordinance. And that concludes our presentation. Please remember that this presentation was recorded on April 24th, 2020 and is subject to change. Please make sure to confirm the information in your city by checking the local city website, which will house the local city ordinance. As this presentation demonstrates, there are a lot of overlapping layers, and there could be a lot of questions depending on where your unit is located. Regardless, it's recommended that all tenants pay whatever rent they can pay, since you will be responsible for paying all of the rent in full at some point within either 6 months or a year. If you have any questions at all, please contact us for assistance. Thank you so much. Best of luck to everyone.